Hi everybody, my name again is Jeff Moore. I've been here with Region 5, or California, about 5 years now. And I've been doing this sort of work since about 1997, so most of that up in Washington. So I've been doing this as long as just about anybody. First of all, just on the front of this, it has me as an interim program manager. I just found out yesterday I did get promoted, so yay me. I'm very excited about that. So I'll be in charge of the program going forward. And also just to mention about state and private forestry. I'm not sure how many people really know about that, but that's a small part of the Forest Service that is just as concerned with the areas outside Forest Service boundaries as what's inside. So also, Region 5 has been doing this sort of work since about the year 2000, and we are actually one of the newcomers in aerial survey. Some areas, such as Region 6 up in Washington, Oregon, have been doing this for over 70 years now. So if we keep doing it, hopefully we'll have the kind of history that those other folks have and can draw upon those historical trends. Also, since I did get this promotion, my recent position may be backfilled. Anybody who'd be interested in doing this sort of work, please let me know after the program. So who we are, we're a very small program. There's just a couple of us. There was 3 of us here in the region doing this work full time. We lost one person up to Oregon, and then we lost the other person up to Oregon. So that leaves just me. So we're down to just one permanent person. And we've been relying heavily on contractors to help us out during the summer. And we had 2 of those on board last summer. And we'll see what happens this summer. It looks like CAL FIRE may be more involved with our program going forward, and that would be a great partnership, potential partnership. But we don't know any specifics about that yet. Pretty much we are flying in a very small fixed-wing Cessna with a dedicated plane and pilot for most of our survey efforts. And they have been just excellent people to work with, and it's all been going great. We also have a agency Cessna that we use on occasion, but it's not in a great location for us, and it's uncomfortable in the back seat, and it has antennas hanging off of it, so we don't use that one very often. And mostly we just go with our contracted 205. Our operating budget then for getting a plane and pilot is somewhere around $100,000, and we've been stretching that budget recently because we've been asked to do some extra surveys early in the season, late in the season, refly areas, and do special projects in addition to that. Also, we already took a hit on our budget for this year because we couldn't finish last year's survey before the 1st of October, and so that time kind of goes against us this year, so we're still trying to figure all that stuff out. And our costs in general continue to creep up. Our hourly rate goes up just a little bit every year, but we continue to get things done every year and just deal with it and overcome. Also, Philip over here flew with us last year to do some training, and he will now be doing this sort of work over in Hawaii, which is also part of Region 5. So rapid OHIA death and some other things. If anybody's interested, it looks like they're going to have some aerial survey information there now and going into the future. So what is it exactly that we do? We usually fly with 2 surveyors on board an aircraft. We'll have one in the co-pilot seat looking out the right-hand side of the aircraft, and the other behind the pilot looking out the left side. And they'll be looking along a swath of about 1.5 to 2 miles on either side as we fly along. And mostly, primarily what we're doing is we're looking for these red dead trees. That's just kind of a term. They don't always turn red. Sometimes they turn yellow or brown, but it's a different color that indicates that the tree is dead and has been dead long enough to where the foliage has dried out and changed color, but it's still on the tree and hasn't fallen off yet. So we typically fly around 1,000 feet above ground level, And that gives us a nice angle to look out on an oblique angle, and I'll talk more about that here in just a minute. Then we also cover most all of the forested areas in the state, regardless of ownership, whether it's Forest Service, Park Service, state, private, or what have you. We try to do the oak woodlands. We try to do the high alpine areas. We just try to cover everything and get one good look at it and see what's going on. And again, we do that every year, once every summer. And we wait until the middle of the summer so that those trees have had a chance to dry out in the sun and change color. If we try to fly things too early, there might still be a little snow on the ground, what have you. Still plenty of moisture in the trees, and the foliage just hasn't had a chance to turn color. Sorry, my voice, I'm going to try to hang in with you. I'm trying to get over a cold, so we'll see how it goes. What the survey is meant to be is just a course overview. It's a quick, down and dirty way of getting a nice pulse of the health of the forests in the area. So it's not meant to be a real detailed, precise, stand-level measurement of dead trees. We're looking more at a 1 to 100,000 type of a scale. You get much inside of that 1 to 100,000, your results are going to be variable as to our accuracy. Looking here, this is a little image of what we use. We have a touch tablet in our laps as we fly along. It's geo-referenced and scrolls along as we fly along. This is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional oblique space, so it's still a little challenging to plot down where you see things based on the actual terrain there off to the side. But we've done some things to kind of trick our eyes into seeing it, you know, putting in the riparian areas, putting in the topography, those sorts of things. We fly with a nape imagery as a background, which is actually for agricultural purposes, but we've changed a few things with the false color in order to make it work well for us. And we don't use satellite imagery per se because we found this to be a superior product for what we need. So you can see that we can see where there's riparian areas, where there's agricultural fields, where the things have been built up, and those sorts of things. All these roads are a big help for getting us oriented and putting things down. But there are still a lot of areas around the state that are really difficult, that are hard to figure out the exact placement. So that's why I say our results are more variable. So what we'll be doing then is flying along, and we see some dead trees off to the side. We try to figure out on the map exactly where that's at and what kind of tree that we're seeing and how many trees that we're seeing. So the first thing would be to draw a quick polygon and then come over here to our quick keys and hit down number of trees or trees per acre that we think is affected, the host that's being affected, and then if there's the other damage that's also detectable by visual sight. Sometimes the polygons are really happening fast and furious. We'll record tens of thousands of polygons in a year, and in some areas then we're just drawing polygons on top of polygons, and it's a bit of a process to try to get all that straightened out then at the end. Also remembering that each of us is only seeing out one side of the plane, and we have to marry those two together at some point and then try to make the whole thing as seamless as we possibly can. So one way of looking at this is flying along at about 110 knots or so, trying to cover up to 2-mile SWAT width. We're looking at about 5 acres a second. So we just got to punch it and go, and we just don't have time to be really finessed about this. And of course, if you look away and look back again, you may miss some things. So it's a really challenging process, and I do love it. I find it to be a great outlet for my scientific as well as my artistic efforts. And what we end up with then is a artist, what we like to call an artist representation of what's going out on the landscape. And again, remembering that this is a two-dimensional reference, and we're trying to change from a three-dimensional oblique to a two-dimensional top-down. So that makes it a little extra challenging. So at the end of the survey, then, what kind of products can you expect for us? Mainly, what we're doing is capturing those red dead trees. That's about 95% of what we capture. Most of those are attributable then to bark beetle or wood borer activity. The big players, of course, would be mountain pine beetle and fir engraver. And then locally, there's a lot of other smaller time players, such as golden spotted oak borer down in San Diego County and those sorts of things. Mortality agents in addition to bark beetles and wood borers would be things like root disease, such as sudden oak death, which we do a lot of all up and down the California coast. Port Orford cedar root disease, Phytophthora lateralis, we don't have very many of those, but where it does happen is very important for us to know. Also, wildlife damage, such as bear feeding damage to young plantations on the north coast, very common. We try to capture that as best we can. And then recently, with the drought ongoing the way it is, we've been doing more and more abiotic, especially drought-related mortality that we can't attribute to bark beetles or anything else. So we just chalk it up as being caused directly by the drought. And in addition to drought, other abiotic factors such as wind throw or water damage, we try to capture that when we see it. So then the other things that we do are non-mortality, such as defoliation events, when we have defoliating insects or some sort of foliar disease, or even recently in this drought as a response, a lot of oaks will drop their leaves very early, much earlier than what they usually do. So we try to capture that as best we can as well. And in fact, during the course of this year, we attributed a lot of mortality in blue oak directly to the drought, but based on some later findings that we were able to get out in the field and check, we decided just to scale all that back, not call those blue oaks dead yet because they were still a little green when you scratched back on the bark in most places. And we're going to look for dead carcasses out on the ground this year and see how much mortality actually did occur in the blue oak. So that created quite a stir, as in the change of the numbers. There's just been a lot of change in our results because of things like that. So just have to bear with us on that. We try to get out the best final answer as we can. Other things that we'll see as we're flying along are things like flagging, such as Phytophthora in true fir, and dieback, especially in things like aspen. Top kill caused by white pine blister rust, etc. And then discoloration, we've recorded a lot of discoloration these last few years, also attributed to drought, especially in low elevation pine. So one of the first things that I always get asked when I say that I do aerial survey is that, oh, you're out there taking photos. And I always have to pause and say, yes, we do take photos, but that isn't primarily what we're trying to do up there. It's mostly drawing on those sketch tablets, trying to get a big picture of the amounts of mortality and where it's at. But we do try our best to take some representative photos of what we see out the window and take pictures as best we can flying along, and then we try to marry up where that picture is to the landscape then afterwards. And those pictures then are all available on our Flickr site, free to download, free to use as you like. But if you do use those in certain publications, it'd just be nice if you gave us the credit for it. And then I would love to know what these things are being used for. So if you wouldn't mind just letting me know afterwards, that would be great. Apologies, I should have checked this. Looks like that photo came across this a little bit in the process of switching over to this. And again, photos are just samples of events. They're just a representation, and we're not in the business of taking aerial imagery per se. That'd be very expensive to do, and it's hard to do on this oblique angle trying to figure out exactly where on the landscape a lot of this is. Top down is much better to georeference. But that top-down oblique angle is pretty critical and pretty unique into the way we detect what we're trying to find. So as you can see on this image, you can see most of the crown of the trees because we're off to the side. Top down, you can't see that at all, and trying to figure out the species of the tree is much more difficult and just much more cryptic. So because we can see so much of the crown, we can get a pretty good guess. Yeah, this is like a ponderosa pine. These look like white fir right here. There's definitely some sugar pine in here, a couple of them, and probably some incense cedar as well. So at that point, we're just kind of stuck as to what we think most of the mortality is. And the way we record things, and we give one tally for the amount of mortality. Say this would be a polygon with about 50 trees to the acre. Then since there are multiple species that have died recently in this polygon, we'll put that in order of precedence. I'd probably put ponderosa pine as being the top mortality host, white fir as a secondary, and then probably sugar pine as a third. And that's as far as we can take it. We can't record any more than 3 types of hosts in a given polygon. So, the human eye, I'd like to just give a plug for that just real quick, is a very versatile and in some ways superior detection tool than photographs or satellite imagery, etc., because it is able to still work very well in poor lighting, in smoky conditions, late in the day, when it's cloudy out, those sorts of things. Anybody who's ever watched a outdoor baseball game or football game on television knows that when things go from in the sun to in the shadow, it's very hard to pick out where that ball is or where what's going on. But if you see that, you actually go to the game and watch the game, your eyes have no problem deciphering that and picking that out and seeing that. So that's a really neat thing about the human eye and some of the things it's capable of. Shadows is a big one, and the eye can penetrate those shadows better than imagery can. So here's a quick and dirty map of California and where we were seeing mortality. These dark red areas are where mortality was more intense. A lot of trees to the acre like the photo I just showed. The yellow is where it's more sporadic, just a few trees to the acre. And you get a good feel real quick as to where the mortality has been concentrated. And this indeed is where the drought has been the most severe for the longest amount of time. They even came up with a new category, exceptional. I'm sure you guys have been talking about this in other presentations. But this correlates very well to where the drought has been the worst for the longest. And indeed, we're starting to pick up additional activity up in other areas now where the bark beetles have been successful now for a couple of years, and are now the populations of bark beetles are much higher on the landscape. So we expect the trends to continue upward, at least for this year, because, especially because 2015 then was the worst drought year so far. The trees that were actually killed and attacked in 2015, most of those we won't change color then until this year. So we're going to actually be mapping a good deal of last year's mortality this year. And I'm sure that the amount of mortality will have another drastic increase. I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I expect that that's going to be the case. And as you can see, other damage over here, the purple, things without mortality that we record doesn't amount to a whole lot, but it does in some places, especially as you start zooming in. Also, here's a good plug for the tree mortality viewer, which is a CAL FIRE product and is a neat way to go in and be interactive with your area of interest. You can go take a look at that. So what kind of deliverables do we have from our survey every year? One of the biggest and most useful things that we do is give a quick interim report in a short time turnaround from when we flew the survey. So we try to fly it, do some basic editing, put things together, and then put out a quick report with some basic key findings, a basic map of where we just flew, and some photos that are representative of what we saw in that area. We have a pretty good library of those, which can all be found here. And in addition to this, not this year, but in previous years, we produce KMZs that you can download and view in Google Earth. Also a very interactive way to look at these areas with co-located photos. So if you click on a polygon where there's a photo icon, it'll load up that photo from the Flickr site, and you can take a look at that really where it's at. I'm meaning to do more of this right now, but it's just me right now, and I just haven't had time. Also, the other thing I haven't had time for is to put together a final report. That's going to be my next up, and anybody who's interested in seeing that when it's finished, please do let me know after this, and I'll put you on my distribution list. And then also the GIS data itself. This is also free download, and you can put it onto your individual systems and take a look at it and take a closer look at your area of interest. Not just this year's, but the historical going back to the year 2000, if you were more interested in doing trend analysis and that sort of thing. So in addition then to the regular survey, we also do special surveys. This year we did an early survey on the Lassen after a big wind event happened, and recorded a lot of blowdown and where it happened and how bad it was in some different areas of the Lassen. And we also did an early regular survey over the South Sierras in Southern California to try to get an idea of how much mortality was going on with the drought being so bad and with so many reports of so many dead trees out there. So we did an early flyover of that, and then we came over again and did it later in the summer, and only used the summer results in our database for 2015 because putting it in twice just didn't make any sense. So we basically removed that early survey from our resulting full-time database. We also did a couple special surveys late, trying to get an idea of where aspen occurred on the Lassen, flying it after the leaves had changed color and they were easy to see from the air. And then we also had a request from the Tahoe to go over the American Fire area and try to help them prioritize where they would want to do some management work. So anybody who is interested in doing a special survey of some sort and are willing to pony up some money to help make it happen, go ahead and contact me, and we'll at least entertain that idea and see if we can't make it happen. So the 2015 results, in a nutshell, we estimated that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 27 million trees killed statewide, and that was across 2.8 million acres. So if you remember, there's 55 million acres of forested land in California, and 3 million acres isn't a huge percentage of 50 million. So we got to remember that in the vast expanses of California forests, everything was pretty darn healthy. And also that not every tree in these areas, in these 2.8 million acres were killed. Most trees probably survived in most areas, and a lot of those areas are probably healthier now with less competition. And as we saw from the map, it became increasingly intense as we got further south into the Sierra Nevada range and staying very active well into Southern California. And again, that's where the drought was the worst for the longest amount of time. The most severely impacted were the low elevation pine type. It wasn't just ponderosa pine, but any fir that was associated, as well as incense cedar and some other things, and as well as a lot of live oak were also impacted and actually outright killed. Even chaparral, there was even a few areas where we saw dead chaparral, and for drought to kill chaparral, that's quite a situation. So if you get higher up into the mountains and further north, generally the drought conditions weren't quite as bad, and it went from wholesale mortality of pine into a mixed bag of scattered mortality, again with white fir being probably the biggest hit. And again, most of these areas, I think, going forward will be healthier for the less competition. But we also have to remember that a lot of trees were being attacked last year that we weren't able to see, and those will be captured this year when we fly the survey this summer. Also, note that drought is not very conducive to spread of diseases such as sudden oak death. Those all stayed pretty flat-lined or even dipped down somewhat. And this year, if we continue to see rains into the spring, we can expect those mortality agents to be more pronounced and active on the landscape. It's probably going in the future. It'll probably take a year to actually kill the trees or more. Also, that mortality rates have been increasing over the last 3 years since really the drought has become underway, and that those rates increased pretty dramatically in 2015. Now, this is known as a lag. It usually takes a couple years after the start of a drought event for the bark beetle populations to increase as they're able to take advantage of those drought-stressed trees. And again, we expect there to be another pretty good increase in the coming year. So what are we expecting then for the future in 2016? The bark beetle populations have had superior reproductive success for the last several years. They are now at very high population levels in many, many places. And when that situation occurs, of course, those beetles will successfully kill trees, even if the tree has sufficient moisture to try to defend itself. It just can't defend itself from that many beetle attacks. And again, the trees that we're going to be mapping were probably killed in 2015 when the drought was at its zenith and when the populations were also at their highest, populations of bark beetles. So the recent precipitation that we've had was really too late in the season to improve tree defenses last year, and we'll wait to see what happens then coming up in the future. Also, if we do get that late season, late spring moisture events because of El Nino, we expect that diseases of all sorts will continue to spread and intensify, and we'll just have to see what we see coming up. And again, remember that blue oak, we decided not to call any mortality numbers on blue oak, and we may be able to capture all of that this year. We'll just have to see how that works out. And also realizing that our drought situation is still ongoing. It has been scaled back some from what we saw in 2015, but there are still significant areas, especially in Central California, where it's still considered to be an exceptional drought situation. So that's pretty much what I have, and I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions from anybody who has any.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Let's see if there's any questions over here. If you've got a question, please type it into the chat box, and then we'll pose it to Jeff. Just by way of, you suggested you could have special surveys. What's the rough cost per hour for a special survey?
Our current contract outside of our exclusive use time period runs somewhere around $500 an hour, and at 110 knots and 3 to 4 miles swath width. Excuse me. That kind of gives you an idea for how much ground we can cover. We can cover quite a bit of ground in just one day, or even just one flight and a half a day.
So acreage per hour?
Yeah, it's going to depend a little bit on a lot of different things, but yeah, about 5 acres a second. We just have to do the math.
5 acres? Wow, 5 acres a second. Great, thanks. Chris is asking, how did you calculate the number of dead trees? How did you estimate those?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I struggle with all the time as I'm flying. What I do is, if we get in these situations where there's just huge numbers of trees spread over huge expanses on the landscape, I try to put a football field down there on the ground, knowing that that's about 1 acre, trying to get a quick snapshot at a couple places how many trees I think are on that amount of land, and then I just expand that as much as I need to try to get the big picture. So when I say 27.8 million trees killed in 2015, that's nowhere near probably the actual specific number, but that does give you a good ballpark representation of what we think we saw.
So John's got a comment here about Manzanita drought mortality at Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
Did you notice that, or did you observe that?
We did. That wasn't our focus. We didn't capture that. Very much of that. We're really interested in large woody biomass, actual trees. But yeah, I did see a fair amount of dead chaparral, and I recorded it here and there. I just didn't spend a tremendous amount of time trying to capture it.
Dave's asking if you expect more bark beetle activity in the northern Sierra.
Yeah, and in fact, we've already had some early reports that there is a lot of mortality in the low elevation pine areas further north. And we're entertaining the idea of flying an early survey up there this year as well, trying to get an early handle on what's going on in some of those areas.
I've heard that the bark beetle populations are going to beat the band this year.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure it'll be another banner year for insect activity.
Henry has got a question about tree mortality in the San Bernardino Mountains and whether or not it's going to reach the levels of the Southern Sierra. Do you have any feelings about that?
Well, the pine type in San Bernardino is a little more localized. It just doesn't have the footprint that the Sierras do. Where you do find real large areas of actual conifers, I think there'll be a lot of mortality going on in those areas, though. Probably not so much in the real high areas, but we'll see. It's just hard to say. It's a pretty cloudy crystal ball, really.
I think we'll just take one more question from Klaus here. He wants to know a bit about what the field crews do on site following the flight. You mentioned that, you do some field verification. That was how you found out about the blue oak.
Yeah.
Is it very extensive of what you do, or what?
No, in fact, I don't have any time to get out in the field anymore. My time is spent either in front of a computer or looking out the window of an airplane, by and large. We really depend on our service area experts that we have throughout the state. Any feedback we get from anybody, we'd love to get feedback, and the sooner the better. Anybody has any early reports on what they're seeing this year, it'd be good to know. Really, we need other people to be the eyes and ears on the ground. There's just not enough of us to go around.
It's probably true that there aren't as many people out there cruising the woods as there used to be.
No, absolutely not. In the early days of aerial survey, there would be whole crews of people following around right after the surveys in order to mark out those big sugar pine for removal. But we just don't operate that way anymore.
Well, Rich Walker,